spent the last 20 years working on water issues, so you can imagine I'm delighted and excited that we're going to spend a few hours talking about this subject that has occupied so much of my time. And as you've heard, water is sort of this funny substance. 90% of the planet's population, in this, the most technological age we have ever had, lives within 10 kilometers of a water body. Water is a determinant of economic development. It's a determinant of growth. And what's exciting about the conversation we're going to have and the interventions that you're going to hear, which I had the privilege of hearing ahead of time in terms of the recordings, is that you're going to get a really multifaceted view of what water is. Often you end up talking about water simply as a problem of access and sanitation or a problem of poverty. But in fact, you'll hear today that water is a fundamental issue of industrialization. It's a fundamental issue of trade. In fact, water is often we say it's a nexus. It's at the nexus of security and water. It's a nexus of food and water, of environment and water, of energy and water, which you'll hear a lot about today. Slide. So one of the things that I hope came through from this, that certainly came through to me, is how much changing material conditions, as expressed by water, droughts, floods, are determinants of security and stability and sustainability. And so I thought I would just add this sort of fact to the discussion. If you look at this picture, and imagine taking all of the water on the planet and coalescing it into a simple bubble, you would get this amount of water. This is the amount of water that we're talking about today, actually. This is the thing that we are spending the afternoon talking about. But of course, what you see here is mostly salt water. It's water in the oceans of the world. We'll talk about those too. You heard Gentiloni talk about the Kunming-Montreal Protocol, which says that we're going to protect about 30% of this. But if you were to ask yourself, what is the water that we actually typically talk about? How much water do we have that's not salt water? Right? So the amount of fresh water on the planet is actually this bubble here. You can see that, yeah? Now, the problem, and the reason why Gentiloni and others consider this an issue of stability, of security, and of sustainability, is that this actually is not the water that you and I experience when we think about water in rivers and waters in lakes. If you ask yourself how much water is there, well, this bubble contains also ice. 2/3 of this is ice locked up in Antarctica, the western East Antarctic ice sheet, and Greenland. And 1/3 of it is in groundwater, most of which is actually not accessible. So how much water is there, and why is it such a security issue? Well, here it is. Look at the Gulf. Do you see that? I'll put a circle around it. There you go. That's the amount of water that we have. That's the thing we are competing over. Now, it's not scarce in the sense that oil is scarce. We don't run out of it. But its distribution in time and space matters a great deal because it's all we have. And certainly it doesn't respect national boundaries. So I just wanted to punctualize the fact that this is the reason why this is such a fundamental security and stability issue. What I wanted to localize here is the comments that the minister started with, which are comments about Venice, actually. Unfortunately, the mayor is leaving, but you've all heard Venice show up a number of times in these conversations. I just want to point out why we're here and why it makes sense to have a conversation about water in Venice. So this is what the Po River, which is the largest river in Italy. For the Americans amongst you, you can think of it as the Mississippi, just smaller, but it's a really important part of the economy of the country. This is what it looked like. This was the trajectory of the Po River in the 11th century. Yeah? And then what happened was that in 1157 there was a major flood, just like we had a few months ago, for those of you who will remember. And that major flood shifted the path of the river north. And what started happening, as you can see up there, Venice is at the top of your screen on the right-hand side, the lagoon started filling with sediment, because you know that the Po River carries an enormous amount of sediment towards the coast. And so what the Venetians did in 1600, this is the year of the Jubilee, is they cut a massive canal. This was a huge hydraulic infrastructure called Taglio di Porto Viro, the cut of Porto Viro, which redirected the Po River southward, yeah, towards further south. And this saved the lagoon. If that hadn't happened, we will be having a conversation here without boats. We'd be essentially 20 kilometers inland. Because then what happened later was that the Po grew and grew and grew and created the delta that we know today. All that sediment would have ended up in the lagoon and shut off all commerce for the Republic. This is to point out that national governments and states have a profound role to manage in managing water for security. In this case, it was a calculus of security, primarily. Yeah? And even a republic like Venice, a country that hasn't been around for 200 years now, with very remote technology, managed to change the environment in a way that you can see from space. In fact, here you go, you can see the profile of Italy right there from space. So this is just to say that the cascading of policies from multilateral to global to national then can have a profound impact on the environment that we live in. We've now talked about this desire for change and for water security, contextualized water security. One of the reasons why people get so agitated about water and water security is that we've transformed it before and we could do it again. What I'm showing you here is a simple metric. It's the amount of storage in the world for water starting in 1900 and going out to the 1970s and 1980s. If you were living in 1900, your average person in the world in 1900 lived essentially indistinguishably from somebody living in the 12th century. If it rained, water would come through your living room. If it didn't rain, you wouldn't have water. In 1904, the Brits in the Egyptian protectorate built the Lower Aswan Dam. That was the first large piece of infrastructure that collected water. That was in 1904. There was virtually no storage in the world. In the matter of a generation, of a lifetime, of a human lifetime, we constructed so much storage in the world to essentially catch a fifth of anything that comes down from the sky. We literally replumbed the planet in a generation. Now, this came at enormous environmental cost, all sorts of things that happened. But fundamentally, we went from a water-insecure world to a profoundly water-secure world, so much so that we have conferences about water because otherwise we don't really talk about it. You just open the tap and it comes out of your kitchen. So that desire to change that the Royal Highness was expressing comes from the fact that, in fact, our society has done it before, particularly for the rich world. It hasn't done it for the developed world yet, and that's the story that is ahead of us. This is a picture map of all the large hydro dams installations in the world. The red and orange dots that you might be able to see are the things that are being built. The blue stuff is the stuff that was built in the past. There are two important facts here. The blue dams that were built in the past are essentially the result of soft power. This was principally the result of Truman's fourth-point strategy. Those of you who remember history will remember Americans going around the world and advising the world on how to build hydropower installations like they had built in the west of the United States. That's what produced all of those dams all across the world, including the Alps. Today, the same is happening. Over the next 20 years, as much hydropower will be built as was built in the last 100 years. It's just not done by European or American companies. It's mostly actually done and led through Chinese soft power and Chinese capital, which is being deployed across the world, in particular in Africa. But I'll draw your attention on the Himalayas, where India is developing a lot of hydropower, and of course across the Adriatic in the Balkans, where a lot of that is happening. Last thing I'll say on this is we talked about the Kunming-Montreal Protocol. The speaker, Sarah, just spoke about this. I'll remind you that the result of the blue stuff happening lost us 90%, 90% of headcount of all animals that depend on freshwater systems. All the fish, amphibians, birds that depend on freshwater species. We've tripled in 40 years, and we've lost 90% of everything that lives in rivers and lakes, largely because of the control and regulation that was done here. But of course, this gave us energy and water security, which is what we're going to talk about this afternoon. So with that, we close the video part of the conversation and we start our discussion in the room. And I've slightly modified the order of speeches just to give shape to the conversation. And we heard just now Sarah talk about the oceans, and so I thought we could come to Lord Charles Powell. He's the former Foreign Affairs and Defence Advisor to two Prime Ministers, Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and he will give us some remarks on the geopolitical implications of the other side of the water story, the salty side, that we haven't spent much time talking about yet. Charles, you'll...